favorite player of all time, Fred McGriff. All right, Fred McGriff. When I was a kid, I was a first baseman. When I was coming up, I was a first baseman. I was a skinny, tall first baseman, and that is what Fred McGriff was. So, Fred McGriff, I identify with him on the ball field because he was tall and skinny and a power hitter like myself playing first base. He was a lefty, I was a righty, but that was my guy, and I wore his number 27. I mentioned the tournament team and all that, so we could pick our number. I will always pick 27, which was Fred McGriff's number. And Fred McGriff, very interesting career because, for one, he's from Tampa, Florida, right? And he was actually drafted by the Yankees, okay? And George Steinbrenner and the Yankees right now, their training camp, their minor league system and all that, they're based in Tampa. So George Steinbrenner had a really strong connection with the Tampa Bay area. And Fred McGriff was drafted by the Yankees, and the Yankees traded him when he was very young, when he was in the minor league still, to Toronto. And McGriff played the beginning of his career in Toronto. And by the time that I really found out about Fred McGriff, he was in San Diego playing for the Padres. And you all know how sometimes there are professional teams that are put together that have so much talent or a collection of stars, and sometimes it is a flash and we do not even remember that there was a collection of talent that was together that was so strong. And that's what it was with San Diego at that time. 1992, I remember that the San Diego Padres, all right, along with my favorite player, Fred McGriff, they also had Gary Sheffield, and of course, they had the best Padre ever, Tony Gwynn. And in that 92 season, it was crazy because Gary Sheffield was going for the Triple Crown. He had a chance to lead all of the National League in batting average, home runs, and RBI. And his biggest competition for RBI and home run was Fred McGriff, all right? And his biggest competition for batting average, of course, was Tony Gwynn, okay? So here's Gary Sheffield, the great Gary Sheffield, who finished his career with 500 home runs. And Gary Sheffield is having this great season where he is challenging the Triple Crown, and his two biggest competition for the other categories are his teammates, all right? And all of them are black, all right? 3 black stars for the Padres. And, yeah, there was so many African-American stars in the 90s, so many African-American players. I'm going to see if I can name 100, all right, from the 90s in a minute. Okay, now you ask somebody to name African-American player or star in the game, and a lot of people will have to really think about it for a minute before they can even start naming guys, okay? Well, in the 90s, there were so many that over 20 years later, I can probably name 100 African-American players who were playing in the 90s. We'll see in a minute. But Fred McGriff, all right, was with that Padres team, and interesting because he was in Toronto first, and Toronto ended up trading him to San Diego for 2 players who would help Toronto win the World Series, and that was Roberto Alomar and Joe Carter, who went from San Diego to Toronto for Fred McGriff, and at the time, Tony Fernandez, shortstop. Yeah, so Fred McGriff, after 92, the 93 season came, and at the trade deadline, all right, McGriff gets traded, and the trade really changed his career for the better because he ended up going to a really good team, the top team, of course, at that time, the Atlanta Braves, at the trade deadline in 93, and that, of course, was when the Atlanta Braves and San Francisco Giants had the last great divisional race, all right? It was the last year before the wild card was put into place in Major League Baseball. So at that time, only 2 teams per league made the playoffs. Only 4 teams total made the playoffs in Major League Baseball. There were 4 divisions, and you had to win your division to make the playoffs. And that year, in the National League West, Atlanta Braves and San Francisco Giants. That was Barry Bonds' first season in San Francisco after leaving Pittsburgh, and he really helped turn the Giants around. So the Giants in Atlanta had a huge race for the division title that year, and San Francisco with Barry Bonds had a huge lead over Atlanta, who Atlanta at that point had been in the World Series the prior two seasons in 91 and 92 and lost, right? So they were running the National League. And so Barry Bonds gets to San Francisco. San Francisco is beasting. Atlanta is about double digits behind San Francisco when they acquired Fred McGriff. Fred McGriff comes, all right, and I remember I was in Atlanta at the time on vacation. My first and only time in Atlanta was when Fred McGriff got traded from San Diego to Atlanta, right? And I remember the first game that Fred McGriff played, he hit a home run, and like a fire broke out in the outfield in Atlanta's ballpark, okay? You all can look up the information, but I remember, yes, his first game, McGriff hits a home run, and a fire like broke out in the outfield somehow. They stopped the game for a while. Then the next game, McGriff, I believe, hit 2 home runs for Atlanta, and it was on from there. And Atlanta would go on to beat the Giants for the division by, I believe it was a game, and the division went down to the last day of the regular season. And the Giants, I remember, were playing against the Dodgers in L.A. I remember, I believe Julian Tavares, I believe, was on the mound for the Giants, and I remember Mike Piazza hitting home run, at least one home run in that last game to help bury the Giants that year in Atlanta. They would go on to win the National League West, either Julian Tavares or Solomon Torres. I think it was Solomon Torres, actually. Solomon Torres was the guy who got the ball for San Francisco on that final day of the season in '93. And the Dodgers lit him up. Atlanta won the division. And Fred McGriff had a huge impact for the Braves. And also around the same time as McGriff getting traded to Atlanta, the great Ken Griffey Jr., who we spoke a lot about last week as he was a big part of the All-Star festivities in Seattle. Ken Griffey Jr. at that same time was in the midst of a streak where he hit 8 home runs. He hit a home run in 8 consecutive games, which is a major league record. He's tied with 2 other guys. He's tied with Don Mattingly, for one, who went 8 straight games in the late 80s hitting at least 1 home run. So Don Mattingly and Dale Murphy also had a home run in 8 straight games. So Griffey at the time he ended up tying those 2 guys, and ended up all 3 of them, he matched their record. So that happened the same time, the same summer in July as McGriff going to Atlanta. And of course I mentioned Griffey Jr. Everyone loved Griffey Jr. at the time, so did me, so did myself, but my number one guy was Fred McGriff. And the Braves that year, they ended up losing in the National League Championship Series to Philadelphia. And then, of course, in '95, with Fred McGriff, Atlanta won the World Series over Cleveland. And that was Fred McGriff's lone championship ring. And the Braves had we all know, a few more chances to win the World Series in the '90s, but were not able to do it. Fred McGriff, though, he is going to the Hall of Fame today. He finished just a few home runs short of 500, and 500 is the nice round Hall of Fame number, all right, that home run mark. So if Fred McGriff had hit 500 home runs, all right, if he had finished his career with that mark, he probably would have been in the Hall of Fame a long time ago. But finally today, Fred McGriff, my favorite player of all time, will go into the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. So congrats to him.